It's 10 times the terror.
Hello and welcome to 10 Times the Terror.
Not okay.
Hello, and welcome to 10 Times the Terror. My name is James.
And I'm Paul.
And on today's spooky special episode, we are channeling our inner, darker selves. That's right, we are talking about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, specifically the 1941 version, which is directed by Victor Fleming and starring Spencer Tracy and Ingrid Bergman. This is obviously not the only version of Jekyll and Hyde, but it's one of the kind of noteworthy ones. So we're going to get right into it. Dad, you and I both had the chance to rewatch it recently. I think it just came out on a Warner Archive Blu-ray, right? So, it's a nice Blu-ray release. And yeah, I know I've seen it for the first time years ago, but having a chance to revisit it was great to kind of catch up on it. So, Dad, I'll throw it to you. Kind of, what's both your kind of feelings about the story itself, Jekyll and Hyde, and specifically this film version?
Yes, the film is very well done. I mean, it follows very closely the 1931 version, and indeed, MGM tried to buy up all of the earlier prints to not get into confusion about the source of the film. But the photography is spectacular, and having it in the Blu-ray, it's a 4K too, by Joseph Ruttenberg, who did all kinds of great movies. Mrs. Minoret, he did Gaslight, and you've got this very strong, almost expressionistic distinction between light and dark, which was not obvious in the earlier prints because it just hadn't been restored to its full force. Victor Fleming had just come off of two kind of more or less well-known films, Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. So, and it is his production we're seeing.
I think
if you look
I've
at
heard
the
those
credits,
films.
it's Victor Fleming's production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But I would say it's a very interesting version, but it's fatally flawed, as a number of these others are, in the confusion of what is at the heart of the story. The heart of in Stevenson's actual story, it's an issue between good and evil, and Jekyll's misguided belief is that if you could separate the good part out from the evil part, the evil could indulge itself, but then kind of no longer be a problem for the good side, and the good side could go on to greater and greater fulfillment and greater heights. That's in there, but it's alongside a different kind of view that the drug that Jekyll is trying to perfect just makes you the opposite. And you see this, for example, when he's doing the early experiments with animals. You've got a very aggressive squirrel and a very tame rabbit, expected. Well, so he injects the serum into the two animals, and the squirrel becomes docile and placid, and the rabbit becomes aggressive. In a later film, the one with Christopher Lee in the lead role called I, Monster, they also make that same point that you have in one case you have a very boisterous, dominant kind of person, and then he's given the drug and becomes very kind of quiet, mild-mannered. Well, that isn't good versus evil. It's one style versus an opposite. So, and I think that's a problem with kind of all of these versions, that they really can't quite be clear about what is the distinction between Jekyll and Hyde. Even in the earlier one, it's almost like Hyde is almost a Neanderthal, kind of an earlier, pre-evolutionary figure, almost ape-like. Here, it's clearly Jekyll goes into this dark side of his own nature, is right there. But I think it suffers from a lack of clarity at the very heart of the story. I mean, sort of for that. That's the negative part. There's a lot of good things about it, but I wanted to say that. Does that make sense? That it's different to say, is the issue between good versus evil, or is it just a question of opposites? That if you're a type A person, you take this drug, you become a a much more shy and reticent person. But that isn't a good versus evil. That's more of just a psychological difference. In other words, is the difference between Jekyll and Hyde a moral difference, spiritual difference, or is it just a psychological difference?
That's a lot to unpack, and I'll do my best to answer.
Yeah,
So,
right.
I have to admit, I've never actually read the original Robert Louis Stevenson story, and I know I need to do that at some point, but I've seen a few of these versions. And I would say kind of like initially what I do like about this version of the story is I like that the transformation is more psychological versus a physical transformation. I like that he's not his hide isn't so kind of monstrous. I mean, he certainly looks very creepy, but he's kind of this like creepy weirdo who also has like these obviously sexual hangups, and I think the whole kind of storyline with Jekyll kind of getting engaged, it seems like there's some sort of like hesitation to get married, and so I feel like that kind of reveals itself in his Hyde version. Obviously, the way he's sort of like abusing and preying on Ingrid Bergman's character, I think really shows a lot. But so I like that distinction, and so I think for me personally, I think the psychological transformation is a little more compelling than it being a direct physical transformation. As to whether or not this is a good versus evil thing or a moralistic conflict, I've always seen the sort of Jekyll versus Hyde as like a Hyde is sort of all of your sort of not just your darker side, but your kind of like your impulses that you would normally kind of be able to keep at bay are now just coming to the forefront and taking over. I don't know if that was the original intention of the story, but that's always how I've seen it. So like Jekyll and Hyde are essentially two sides of the same coin. It's not so much that you're becoming a completely new person. It's more just like it's showing the kind of worst version of yourself. Is that how you kind of see it?
Yeah, I think that works. There's a later version called The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, but that really applies to this version. So I do think that there could have been, and this could be an issue with the script, greater clarity as to what is really going on here. The thing that I think is striking is that the differences between Jekyll and Hyde are minimal, and you have this, in the earlier version with Fredric March and even earlier with John Barrymore, you've got just sort of a repressed sexual urge in Victorian England, and it's the repression that's being worked out. Here, it's just there's a bizarre sense of this in the one of the first transformation. You have this scene which is kind of amazing, I think, for 1941 Hollywood with the production code, where it's Jekyll is whipping the two women in his life, who are very, we don't only see them from the shoulders up, but the impression is that they're nude, and he's whipping them, and it's not Hyde who's whipping them; it's Jekyll.
And not just
And
whipping them, but almost as if it's like a carriage, like they're like the horses leading the carriage. That's why it is kind of a bizarre image, yeah.
yeah, it's like they're horses, and they morph into the two women, and he's if you look at you go back and you look at his face in that scene, it's a very rabid kind of picture. And then you have the very very disquieting point that was not there in the earlier versions, where when Ivy goes to see Jekyll, she she does realize even at that moment that he's something. She sees something of Hyde. Now as she's leaving, and he's promising her that he'll make sure that Hyde never troubles her again, and she'll never be bothered by him. Of course, he can't guarantee that because he's lost control. But she turns as she's walking away and says, uh, "For a moment, I thought," and he doesn't finish the sentence, but it's that we turn out later that Hyde confronts her with the fact that you saw something of me in Jekyll, and so that the distinction between Jekyll and Hyde is not as sharp, as striking as it is in some of the other versions. And I think that makes this a lot more interesting in the sense that it's like if Jekyll had never fooled around with the drug and had married his fiancee, would he eventually have become an abusive person? Because is that latent within him? And this film seems to suggest that.
Well, also, yeah, it kind of blurs the line between Jekyll and Hyde. It's not so much a one or the other. It's almost like they overlap. There's sort of
Yes,
you
yeah, I think
kind of be.
and I think it's Hyde is not monster. Hyde is just sort of an evil-looking Jekyll. You know,
Oh yeah, big furry eyebrows and all.
yeah, right. But he's not not like Fredric March was really a monstrous figure. You know, people would avoid him in the street, kind of a thing. Whereas that's not the case here with his Hyde.
And personally,
Uh,
I find that, I mean, I haven't seen the Frederick March version in a while, but I find that a little more compelling because the way it is in like that version, it's almost like an Incredible Hulk kind of thing where you just turn into this
hmm
giant monster. And this, it's more like, yeah, I think it's more seeing the kind of like you said, like are these the actual impulses that Jekyll has that he's trying to suppress, and now as Hyde they kind of come out more. I was gonna say like that scene you're talking about where where Ivy sort of is confiding to Jekyll is very good, but my favorite scene is the one where Ivy's friend, I think it's Marcia, goes to
hmm
visit her, and how they can see that she has some bruises on her, so you can kind of can infer that she's been sexually abused, and then Hyde shows up and sort of like scares Marcia away. But the way he kind of confronts Ivy, he's so icy and cold, and it's such a tense scene. And the way he kind of like I said, like preys on Ivy is really unnerving. But I would say I think maybe my overall kind of criticism of this film is that while I like this interpretation of Hyde, I do feel like by the time we get to the end, it almost feels like they overstep their hand of trying to then make Hyde more of an actual monster, and then we have kind of a more climax. I feel like even his makeup in the last 10-15 minutes looks a little more monstrous and not as, I don't want to say subtle, but as like subdued as it was early in the film. It almost feels like they have to kind of go more in the sort of conventional route, whereas I wish they had kind of stuck more with the psychological way they were
hmm One of the interesting background points is that as originally conceived, uh, the Ivy part was going to be taken by Lana Turner, and Jekyll's fiance was going to be played by Ingrid Bergman, which would at first glance would seem to make more sense. That uh, Lana Turner being kind of a barmaid type, and Ingrid Bergman being very kind of pristine and upright. And apparently, Ingrid Bergman wanted the part of Ivy, and went to Victor Fleming about that. And then Fleming talked with Lana Turner, and Lana Turner was actually relieved. She felt that the demands of the Ivy part were a little bit above her level of being able to be portrayed effectively. So that's kind of interesting. It's like a casting against type. You think that Lana Turner would be the kind of kind of a glamorous, earthy barmaid, and Ingrid Bergman the kind of cool, aloof Victorian fiance. And I think that the flip, I think, works a lot. Um, yeah, so I like what I think is disturbing about the film, that in the sense that it's effective, is this idea that the difference between Jekyll and Hyde is not as great as we would like to think it is. He's talking earlier about this other side, and this man who goes berserk in the church service and so forth, which again almost sounds like schizophrenia of some kind. And everybody's warning him about getting into an area that he can't control, and that this class of thing going beyond the limits of what God has established, and so forth. But this idea that there's uh, that the dark side is very near the surface, uh, and I think in the story, Jekyll underestimates the power of if you will, the dark side, the evil side, which takes over his whole personality. In the film, um, it's more the idea that that the difference between Jekyll and Hyde is not that big, and that if somebody met the two of them, that almost comes out, but not quite, with Dr. Lanyon. He transforms himself, you know, because he couldn't get access to his laboratory to get the potion. Lanyon doesn't quite do that, But there is this kind of this sense of, and certainly that thing with Ivy, that the the line between Jekyll and Hyde is not that sharp. There's a real overlap there, and I think interesting, the idea that you're going to make that strange dream sequence where he's whipping the women, that it's clearly Jekyll and not Hyde that's doing the whipping. I think that's very interesting.
I agree. Well, as a retired pastor, do you think that this is also maybe just a way to kind of humanize not just the characters but the story itself, to kind of show that all people have some sort of a duality in them, that's not so much schizophrenic, but as just that we all have these kind of darker impulses, and whether or not we act on them is a matter of one's own character, but like we all kind of have these you know um, questionable, if not morally wrong, kind of feelings inside of us.
Yeah, I think it has to be uh, to quote from Star Wars, a dark side, kind of reality. It's not just that it's an opposite, purely psychological, but it is psychological in the sense that there is this undercurrent in all of us, and it seems at first that everybody who's objecting to what Jekyll was saying about his work seem to be rigid, repressive Victorians. But the thing is, in the light of what film works out, they aren't. I mean, however strict they might be in what other area, they're right. They're warning Jekyll about something that's going to really destroy him and the people around him. This is a very dark. I mean, this is tragedy on the level of the Greeks and Shakespeare. Think about this. Yeah, what all happened? How, Jekyll Jekyll destroys himself. He murders his future father-in-law and utterly traumatizes his fiancee, and he's murdered his so-called girlfriend. I mean, the body count is like something you'd see in a Greek play. You're totally removed from any kind of a happy end.
Definitely.
It's a I think it's a clear moral warning that we do have this dark element in us, and the idea that we have in Jekyll's mistake is we figure if we could somehow give in to our desires and impulses, we'll be better for it. And what this is saying is no. To the extent that we give in to things that are really beyond our control, we're playing with fire. We're setting up our own destruction, which is a classic theme in Gothic horror. Frankenstein creates a monster that ends up destroying him. Dracula takes people under his control and is going to turn them into vampires. So that there's this other element of our being, and what gets quoted in the actual story is the whole idea of the sinful side, and it quotes from Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, "The good that I want to do, I don't do. The evil that I don't want to do is what I do. Wretched man that I am." That you need to recognize that this is serious stuff, and you the idea that which we certainly have more, I think, in today's world, that indulgence is not the answer to human desire. We desire things that are often very superficial, and we want to indulge ourselves by getting those things. But what we don't realize is that those things may come with a terrible price tag. That makes sense?
Yeah, and well, and kind of like as you're mentioning those other stories, like there's a sort of like self-sabotage quality to that. You're the one that sort of brings your own destruction.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will say though, I mean, again, coming out in 1941, it does feel like all of the talent involved, obviously Spencer Tracy, Ingrid Bergman, Lana Turner, it seems like everyone's kind of at the top of their game. I mean, they're kind of all in their prime. So yeah, I think it does come together to create something special. And like you said, it's a very dark movie for kind of early 40s. And I know you mentioned like the cinematography. I think the movie looks great, especially all of the gaslit sort of
Oh yeah.
nighttime sequences. Like it really has this very kind of gothic, very moody sort of aesthetic to it.
Yeah, it's Joseph Ruttenberg, who was one of the greatest cinematographers in Hollywood history. And if you want to see a companion piece of it, it's Gaslight. He did the photography on the Gaslight with also Ingrid Bergman.
Yeah, I have seen it. That is a good one too.
And so that's very. So I think I just think that the conception of the story needs a little more clarity from when I look at it. That what is really going on here? Is it it's one thing to say that this is the opposite side of your other nature, but it's a different thing to say that this is your darker nature. And the idea being that human beings have a good side to them, which is offset against whatever kind of evil intentions they have. And what Jekyll, unfortunately, has done is he's removed all the restraint of the good side and only has now the evil side. And I also think that there's a sense in which, Hyde is a Nazi kind of figure, especially these taunting scenes where he's spitting out the grapes and this kind of cultured thing. He said, well, what should we do? You could read to me, Paradise Lost would be nice, but we probably don't have the book. Playing the piano. He's a cultured figure in a way that the other, I think both Fredric March and John Barrymore are a little more bestial. He's a cultured figure, but he's kind of like an image of the Nazis, or like a Joseph Goebbels or somebody like that. So I think that's lurking there in the background in a 1941 film.
Haven't there been other versions though? And maybe they're more modern, but other versions that have kind of shown the difference between Jekyll and Hyde as more psychological than really transformative.
Yeah, the one with Christopher Lee called I, Monster is very much, I think, about a pretty complete psychological interpretation. And I think even there, the Jekyll character has a different name, but even there, he's quoting Freud stuff. It's sort of the unconscious, the unknown part of our nature is, and I think that's there much stronger kind of way. The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll is interesting in the sense that the idea there is that again, the line between Jekyll and Hyde is not that sharply delineated, but that basically Hyde is the dark side of Jekyll, and that all the things that are in Hyde are already there in Jekyll. Whereas that John Barrymore in his version, he's kind of a more naive figure, and the irony there is that it's his future father-in-law who introduces him to kind of the dark side of London, and that's what he begins to follow once he takes the drug. But there are lots and lots of versions. Those are just some of the more obvious ones.
Well, I think going back to this version, I think as we kind of already sort of gone over, the idea that we see Jekyll himself kind of like with sort of like imagining whipping the two women just shows you that, or at least in this interpretation, that Hyde has sort of like always been kind of like lingering inside him, and really the serum is just a chance to sort of expose that and bring it to light.
Yeah, another thing about I kind of agree with you that they everybody goes a little bit over the top at the end, because it's not only that you say his makeup makes him look more ferocious, but he also becomes more animalistic. He's jumping in through glass windows and doors and all this, running. The scenes of him running through London are very impressive. But he then does become a little ape-like, don't you think?
Yeah, I feel like they're trying to make it more of like a Universal monster movie.
Yeah, right. I think you're right. And
well, and I will say, even though I like the psychological interpretation, the one kind of nitpick you can raise is, okay, well then, when Ivy is seeing both Jekyll and Hyde, like, is she not going to recognize the eyes? Is she not going to recognize that, like, hey, you look kind of similar to Jekyll, or vice versa? Like, so that's one kind of nitpick you can raise.
Yeah, it's
not so much a disguise at that point.
but I think that scene is very effective where she turns back and says, "For a moment, I thought, like he sees the similarity of the two." Um,
Yeah, that does.
and Jekyll is I think suffers from a real sense of hubris and pride in what he's trying to do. The other versions, other big Hollywood ones with both John Barrymore and Fredric March, that Jekyll is a more caring kind of person. He's taking care of poor people in the hospital, and he's much. I mean, he's an aggressive kind of figure, but he's definitely someone who's focusing on the greater good, whereas Spencer Tracy's Jekyll just seems to be focusing on his experiments to prove a point, and he thinks that that's going to help, but he doesn't show the same kind of concern for caring and kindness that the others do.
I was gonna say, yeah. I mean, this Jackal is not very likable. I mean, he's like very like dismissive of his fiance. He doesn't actually seem to want to get married, which is also I think part of the like sexual frustration he has. But yeah, but even like the kind of beginning scenes, like the way he's sort of like talking with like the father and stuff, like he just seems very kind of like yeah, has like this hubris, this like kind of ego to him, which maybe is part of maybe that's how it's kind of originally shown in the novella, but yeah, I just found this Jackal not that likable.
No, I think the novella is also Jekyll is more of an older middle-aged person, and when he becomes Hyde, he becomes younger because he's repressed that evil side, and he's worked on the high principle moral side. But then what he quickly learns is that once he's given vent to the evil side, it then just takes over everything.
Interesting. Yeah, no, it
And we
definitely
do
seems.
have the Fredric March one is coming out in a week or so. So it'll be interesting to see how that looks again with the restoration.
Yeah, it's another one that I know I've seen years ago, but I'm probably due to revisit.
Yeah, Fredric March won the Best Actor Academy Award for his role there.
Okay. Very good. Yeah, no, I see this Victor Fleming version was nominated for 3 Oscars but didn't win any. It was best cinematography, no surprise, best film editing, and best score.
Yeah, there's also there's some ambiguity I think at the end where there's you have this Jekyll is Hyde is killed and turns back to Jekyll's death, but you've got his butler reciting the 23rd Psalm, and that actually was set to music as a whole. I think as a separate piece by Franz Waxman, who was a great composer in film. And you've got this, the Lord is He restoreth my soul, and everything like, well, wait a minute, he's just. Is this a case where the redemption is too easy? I mean, here's somebody who is absolutely ruined people's lives, horrible cruelty, and at the end you're just going to recite the 23rd Psalm as though somehow this is redemption. To me, it's sort of the worst kind of a add-on religious element in a film that doesn't. To me, I don't think really fits. I think the Fredric March one is it makes more sense. It ends with a bubbling cauldron, which is more of a symbol of judgment, fiery damnation or whatever. But I just um, it's too much of a good night, sweet prince sort of ending, as though somehow um, Jekyll's crimes can just be passed over. Say, well, God loves us all, and He restoreth my soul, leads me in the paths of righteousness. Yeah, but that's not Jekyll or Hyde, much less. So to me,
Yeah,
it's a little too sentimental. Does that make sense?
it's not a very earned ending because you're right. Jackal's not really a victim in this version.
Yeah, and there's no confession or no. I mean, Fredric March is tormented. Now he's not willing to turn himself in. He didn't really repent, but you'd have to go down to the police and say, I killed that girl, that Ivy. But at least he has a lot more remorse. This Jekyll doesn't. I mean, and Fredric March, is trying to pray, but his prayers aren't being answered. But at least he's trying to pray. That So I think that this is a little too much of a distanced kind of figure. Yeah, it's not a Jekyll that you warm up to, way we kind of expect you should. And he's coming across more as the scientist than as the doctors trying to heal the poor and the sick.
Yeah, it seems like I think kind of going off, like not just that, but the whole kind of ending climax. It does feel like the sort of last 10 minutes are kind of the weakest part of the movie because it does feel like they're trying to change it into something it's not.
Yeah, it's and it is that I don't think making him more ape-like all of a sudden good. But that's been there throughout the whole Fredric March thing. That there is a bestial quality to his Hyde. Where you're right, it comes out at the very end here. He's jumping over walls and running through the streets, smashing through windows, and jumping all around the laboratory when he's confronted there. So, but part of I think, lesson of that has to be at the end, rather than having any kind of repentance. Jekyll has fully become Hyde, and he's always been Hyde. And there's this sort of a slight covering that's separating the two. Whereas he'd like to think that there's a sharp difference. The difference is back to that strange image where he's whipping the two women. That to me is an amazing scene for the production code in Hollywood at this time. So strict, right?
Yeah,
But anyway, there it is.
Talk about sexual hang-up.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Okay, well, I feel like we've kind of gone over this enough. I think we both sort of have a lot of the same sort of feelings about this. That it is a worthy version of this film, but not a flawless fighting.
Right, it's not a definitive treatment, but it's a very interesting one.
Yeah, I definitely would say if you're interested, it's definitely worth checking out.
Yeah, and you've got really good performances. You've got tremendous cinematography, and you've got one of the best directors in Hollywood at that time. And it'd be interesting to know more how if you interviewed Victor Fleming as to what kind of what he was seeing in this, in the fact that he's above the title. It's Victor Fleming's production of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
Right.
Anyway, we don't have that, so but we'll be interested to see the Fredric March versions being restored.
That could be another podcast down the road.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. Well, I think that kind of wraps up this week's episode of 10 Times the Terror. Again, I'm James.
I'm Paul.
See you guys next time.
Thank you for listening to
It's 10 Times the Terror,
the podcast.
One of my favorite films ever. Let's do that for again. Thank you for listening to 10 Times the Terror. This podcast would not be possible without listeners like you. You can find out more about our podcast by visiting our website, 10timestheterror.com. That's 10xtheterror.com.